and welcome to Tina Talks Keto, episode 14. My name is Tina Barkan, and I have been following the keto way of eating for a little bit over 3 years. Today, I want to talk about people that I follow, the influencers, I should say, that I follow, and why, and also provide some suggestions as to their differences and how to go about following different people who have sometimes different ideas in mind. So let's talk first about Dr. Robert Cywes. I follow him, and he is also my physician when it comes to low-carb eating. And actually, not only that, any kind of problems that I have when I have a Zoom meeting with him, or even in person. I have met with him in person. I tend to go to him first in terms of any kind of medical issues that I have, especially if I think that keto has something to do with potentially why I'm feeling the way I'm feeling. Okay, the other three that I want to talk about are going to be Dr. Ken Berry, Dr. Annette Bosworth, and Dr. Eric Westman. These, I think, are probably the four major influencers that I follow. I do listen to a ton of other people. But in general, the other people that I listen to are subsets of what these four people have to say. So starting with Dr. Cywes, his basic approach these days is to eat as little as possible, which I find amusing to some extent because it's pretty hard to do. And theoretically, those of us on keto are told quantities don't matter, calories don't matter. The only thing that matters is carbs. So why is Dr. Cywes saying essentially eat as little as possible? He actually believes that we could go without eating, and our body fat has more than enough nutrition to last for quite a while. He also has something like, I want to say 300 videos on YouTube. So he's known as the Carb Addiction Doc, and I certainly recommend you're watching any of his videos. I've watched them all in sequence. I think that's extremely worthwhile to spend some time. If you have limited time, then you can zero in on his subject matter. So if you're interested, for example, on seeing what he has to say about protein, which is different than Dr. Berry and Dr. Westman, not so much different from Dr. Boz, but you could then search Dr. Robert Cywes at Cywes, even though he pronounces it VES. You can search his name and the word protein, and you'll find all of his videos on that. So starting back at the beginning, let's think about if you're brand new to the keto way of eating, what is the most essential part of this? And that is low carbohydrate eating consumption. Everything else that we're going to talk about, or that you read about, or that you watch on anybody else's videos, is on top of the fundamental fact that you must limit carbohydrate consumption. Without doing that, none of the other parts are going to work for you. So that's just like the floor. You cannot do anything other than that. And once you do that, and when you start with that, you're likely to be very successful in the beginning, regardless of which person you decide to follow moving forward, or even following several people moving forward. So that is absolutely fundamental. As few carbs as you can possibly tolerate. I would venture to say that the younger you are, you might be able to tolerate more carbs. Now, when I say more carbs, the ceiling that most of the influencers follow is under 20 total carbs a day. Not net carbs, total carbs. I would venture to guess that some people will be okay and will still be able to lose weight and be successful, potentially eating 40 or 50, remotely even 100. But I found that when I started this, the first week or so, I set my threshold at 40. And I didn't have any success in the first week or so. It was like, this is really frustrating. Nothing is happening. I'm not seeing the scale moving. Let's drop it down to 20. And then I saw some definite success. So most people will do well under 20 for sure. After that, you can play around with it a little bit, see how you do. Going forward, the next thing that people run into if they're new is something called insulin resistance. And I found that after the first, I want to say about 6 weeks, when I took about 12 pounds off, I flatlined. I didn't lose any weight for about 5 months. Why was that? Most likely because I was insulin resistant, which means that your body needs more and more and more insulin to try to do the job of reducing sugar and in your bloodstream. And as you have your body trying to use more and more insulin to achieve the effect of reducing your blood sugar, insulin blocks fat loss. So when you're in a state of high insulin, you're in a state where you cannot burn fat, and consequently, you can't burn weight. Insulin resistance needs to be changed over time to insulin sensitivity. And that can take a while. And that's probably one of the most frustrating parts of the lack of success, because you don't have a lot of control over forcing your body into becoming insulin sensitive other than not eating carbs. And it actually takes time for you to become less and less insulin resistant. It never goes away entirely, but it goes away to the point where once you are insulin sensitive, your body is able to burn fat and you can start losing weight. So following Dr. Cywes' approach, he is one that recommends as little food as possible, probably as little fat as possible, as little protein as possible, and no carbohydrates. He believes in a theory called sequential eating, which means that you cook up your normal portion that you think you want to eat. And then when you bring that food to the table, you bring about a third of it, maybe half of it. And you eat that. And you get up and you move away from your plate. You don't go back for seconds. You go off and wander around, take your dog for a walk, clean up the kitchen, anything that you can do for 15 minutes to 30 minutes that doesn't involve food. And then he believes that if you go back and you see that other portion sitting there and you're hungry, and actually, I'm not sure he even cares if you're hungry or not. If you want to eat that other portion, you can eat it. For the most part, once people have been distracted and their body starts to feel the sensation of fullness from the food that they did eat, most people will just put that in the fridge and save it for the next day. And this is his philosophy for how to go about losing weight. And he, basically says, what's the best diet? These days, is what he's saying is what's the best diet? And the best diet is don't eat and let your body burn the fat that it already has. If you get a diet plan from Dr. Cywes, it is unlimited protein, under 20 total carbs, and vegetables, which he says are unlimited, the cruciferous type of vegetables. So your lettuces, cabbage, string beans, broccoli, cauliflower, not sweet potatoes, not peas, and of course, no beans, no lentils, no grains. Exactly what you would expect from any influencer telling you to stay away from carbohydrates. I did find in the very beginning when I started following his plan with vegetables being unlimited, which, he says that they are. And in fact, you can overeat your vegetables. And I had to cut back, which actually for me was fine because I'm not a vegetable fanatic. I think people who love vegetables may have some issues with holding back. But I'm not one of those. So I move forward with that, with eating some salads. That's basically, I'll eat some salads, some tomatoes, and I will eat some green beans. I will eat asparagus. I will eat some broccoli, but for the most part, limited amounts, small pieces, because the carbs do add up. So that's basically why I follow Dr. Cywes, A, because he is my doctor, B, because I think it's pretty easy to follow what he has to say. And the new thing for me, or the difference of his approach and some of the other approaches, is that he does believe in limiting how much you eat. Let's move on to Dr. Berry. Dr. Ken Berry. Proper human diet is his claim to fame. And by the way, I have spent time with all of these people in person. So I've had conversations. I think I understand what they're trying to say quite well. They've all had input into my own health to some degree, most being, of course, Dr. Cywes, but also I spent some significant time with Dr. Berry. He believes in eating until you're comfortably stuffed. And he uses those exact words. So again, under 20 total carbs, every single person that I'm going to talk about here, the 4 major people that I'm going to talk about, are under 20 total carbs. He is eat as much as you want of the foods that you're going to eat. He leans very, very heavily towards carnivore, which is a meat-based plan where you eat no other foods than animal-based proteins. You can eat beef, ruminant animals, chicken, fish, shrimp, pretty much all the sources of protein that you want: lamb, veal, goat. But very, 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 if you're eating full carnivore, then no vegetables. If you're really going full carnivore, I would recommend looking it up, because I don't eat full carnivore. I eat more like what's called ketovore, which is a few deviations from full carnivore. You can have a vegetable or two here or there. You can have some spices. Of course, eggs. Don't forget about eggs. And dairy. Now, I eat a reasonable amount of dairy, but I think there's some question as to whether or not full carnivore includes dairy or doesn't include dairy. And it is important to note that a tremendous amount of people, I believe it's actually 70% of the population, have some form of dairy intolerance. So one of the great things about a fully carnivore diet is that it is also a wonderful elimination diet to see what foods you're sensitive to. Dr. Berry's recommendation, he is the beef, butter, bacon, and egg guy. So he's the one who recommends sticking to those 4 foods, and to do that for somewhere between 30 and 90 days. The longer that you do it, the more effective it's going to be. Again, remember, if you're new to this process and you're just starting out, you're not going to eliminate insulin resistance any faster than what your body is going to let you do it. So if you stay away from all your carbs, but you have, under 20, whether you eat carnivore, whether you eat ketovore, or whether you eat keto, it's your body that needs to learn how to become insulin sensitive, and that can take a while. There are a couple of videos by Dr. Cywes where he actually talks about how long that takes. And he says in at least 1 or 2 of them that it can be anywhere from 6 months from when you start to potentially 18 months. We're all different. And one of the things that's worth paying attention to as you go forward with this way of eating is to learn how you yourself are feeling, because that can teach you a lot in terms of who to follow going forward and what makes sense for you. So Dr. Berry, back to Dr. Berry, he believes in eating until you're comfortably stuffed. And that's a lot of food for many, many people. The other problem, I don't have actually a problem with it. I think he's got a very, very valid point. I have a problem personally eating until I'm comfortably stuffed because I don't know when I'm comfortably stuffed. I tend to feel hunger until I take that one last mouthful, and then I feel sick. So I do better following Dr. Cywes's approach of taking a small amount of food, sitting down, eating that, and then going and doing something else and putting the rest of it away. So again, learn your body and how you're doing with it, and then you can make decisions as to whether or not you're comfortable eating until you're comfortably stuffed. And then your digestion hits in and you go forward. Dr. Berry also tends to recommend a 1 meal a day, or at the most 2 meals a day of food. And that's another thing, by the way, that Dr. Cywes also recommends. Dr. Cywes is adamantly against snacking. So you eat your meal, you put it away, you walk away from the table, and you do not graze. Now, there's a very, very good reason for that. As you sit, and if you keep wandering back to the refrigerator, even if you're eating keto foods, you are going to have your insulin stay up because your blood glucose, even with some keto foods, is going to rise. When your blood glucose rises, your insulin rises. When your insulin rises, it blocks fat loss. So constantly wandering into the kitchen, looking in the refrigerator because you're bored or for whatever what, you're not hungry. If you're bored and you keep sort of grazing, you're really not going to accomplish your end goal, which is to lose some weight and to feel better. I mean, I'm sure there's many of you who are eating a ketogenic way of eating or living a ketogenic way of eating because you just don't feel well eating carbs. And you learn pretty quickly what that means when you go on to a carbohydrate-free food plan. Muscles hurt less, joints hurt less. You generally feel better. And that's an important piece. It's not just the weight loss, it's also how you actually feel. So Dr. Cywes is no snacking. He believes that any kind of snacking is an emotional event. That being said, he also believes in what he calls a bridge, which for him is a cup of black coffee. And when you get into that point of feeling like you need to eat something and you kind of getting antsy, go make yourself a drink. Hot tea, water with lemon, black coffee, even broth if it doesn't have too many calories. All of that is a way to eliminate snacking. And I, again, recommend finding Dr. Cywes's videos where he talks about using coffee or other things like that as a bridge. It doesn't break your fast because he's talking about black coffee. I put some cream in my coffee. So there's that, which means, I guess, theoretically that I'm not ever actually fasting. I think I am if I'm not eating. But again, that's an individual feeling about how you want to deal with that. So Dr. Berry, 1 meal a day, maybe 2 meals a day. Dr. Cywes, no snacking, 1 meal a day, 2 meals a day, a lot less food than what Dr. Berry is talking about. Okay, so let's move on to Dr. Bosworth, affectionately known as Dr. Boz. She is much closer to Dr. Cywes than Dr. Berry in terms of quantity of food. She believes in developing a keto chemistry. And part of the keto chemistry is identifying your macros and knowing how much fat, protein, and carbohydrates by percentage you should be eating in a given day. And she believes that this chemistry is extremely important to success on a keto diet. Now, one of the things that's interesting with Dr. Boz's approach, and we haven't really talked about it much with Cywes or with Dr. Berry, is the percentage of fat that you want to eat. Now, Dr. Berry says eat fatty meats. Dr. Cywes actually says eat fatty meats, just a lot less of them. Dr. Boz gets very, very specific in terms of your percentage of fat versus your percentage of protein versus your percentage of carbohydrates. And she believes in about 80 to 85% fat, less, I think, than 5% carbohydrates, and the rest of it would be protein. I have found personally for me that I cannot digest that much fat. Doesn't mean you shouldn't, and it doesn't mean that her plan is bad. It just means that individually, some of us can't tolerate fat. I would highly, highly, highly recommend that you start with a lot of fat, because the fastest way to developing a good keto chemistry is to keep those percentages in line. So Dr. Boz is right for most people. Now, I did actually talk to her about this because I said I end up with very, very upset stomach and gut problems and all sorts of issues if I typically need to stay 60, 65% fat, which is outside of her guidelines in terms of what you should be eating. But I did talk to her about this, and she said, yes, about 20% of her patients need to follow or need to eat less fat. That's what she specifically told me. So if you're listening to your own body and you start having problems eating that much fat, then cut back on it. Pay attention. And I personally think there's nothing wrong with logging what you're eating. Now, neither Dr. Berry nor Dr. Cywes make any mention whatsoever about keeping a food diary or logging your food or figuring out your macros. It's just not something that they talk about. Dr. Boz is all about the numbers and all about data. So if you're a data geek, you're probably going to love her plan. And again, I highly recommend starting with her approach, especially if you're new. I think that there's a lot of people who have been following keto and who end up on plateaus and who end up getting stuck because they've been doing it for a really long time and they need to learn what actually works for them. In the beginning, so once you get past the insulin resistance issues and you get past what we call carb creep, so going back to being, if you're absolutely brand new at this and you're not seeing results, I would say the very first thing to look at is really identify and write down what you're eating, because you'd be surprised at the amount of carbohydrates that actually live in different foods. You put cream half and half in your coffee, for example, or use some kind of coffee creamer, and you don't measure it and you go, and I'm going to pour that into my coffee. Well, you just poured 2 or 3 tablespoons, believe it or not, into your coffee. A tablespoon of heavy cream or a tablespoon of half and half is not a lot of cream, and your coffee is going to look quite dark. When you use that, that's 2 or 3 carbohydrates. You do that 3 or 4 times a day, and you've achieved 20 total grams of carbohydrates without eating anything else. So I would say if you are struggling and you're finding that this keto diet that you're trying to follow is not working, look at what you're eating, write it down, do a log, use Chronometer. That's the most preferred software or app to use to figure out what you're eating. MyFitnessPal is another one. Lose It, Carb Manager. There's a bunch of them out there. I recommend you definitely go and see what you're actually putting in your mouth, because I think you'll be very surprised at how fast these carbs add up. So here we have 3 of them so far. I follow Dr. Cywes because he is my doctor. I tend to listen to him the most. I also talk to him about the fat issue and why I'm struggling with my gut issues and stuff like that. I talked to Dr. Berry. I have not been able to do the eat as much as you want until you're comfortably stuffed. That doesn't mean that you can't do it. Now, Dr. Berry is another person that I talked to and said, I just can't eat like that. It makes me feel sick. And he said, just as Dr. Boz said, yeah, about 20% of the people I talk to struggle with that. So you may be in one of these 20%. Doesn't mean you're wrong. Okay, so follow what your body is telling you. Dr. Boz says, eat MCT oil. Eat, swallow, drink, have a capsule of MCT oil. Especially MCT oil is moderate or medium chain triglycerides. MCTs 8 and 10 are the recommended ones. Bulletproof coffee has an MCT oil. MCT oil is a great addition because it stimulates ketone production in your liver. Goes straight to the liver, gives you extra ketones. Many, many people can tolerate a lot of MCT oil, and a lot of people take a lot of MCT oil. I'm one of those who cannot tolerate even a quarter teaspoon of MCT oil. So again, you have to pay attention to what you're eating and what it does to your body. There's no point in following this plan or way of eating if you end up spending the day in the bathroom. It's just not useful or productive to you. But it doesn't mean that you shouldn't eat low carb. It's not the carbohydrates or the lack of carbohydrates that's putting you in the bathroom. It's typically the amount of fat that you're eating. So if you need to reduce fat, then learn what your body is willing to tolerate. You still will have success. I'm down 63 pounds. I'm sitting about right now 2 pounds below my goal weight. I lost all of that weight in the first, I think, year and a half or so. And then I've just been maintaining. My version of maintaining is still eating pretty much less than 20 total carbohydrates. I will occasionally go up to maybe 30, depending on how many vegetables or tomatoes or whatever I decide I want to eat, or avocado, one of my more favorite foods, or cottage cheese. But again, you got to watch for carb creep. Cottage cheese is allowed on this plan. Avocados are allowed on this plan. Half an avocado is 6 total carbs. Half a cup of cottage cheese, a full fat cottage cheese, is also 6 total carbs. So if you have a half a cup of cottage cheese and a half an avocado, you've already eaten 12 total carbs out of your 20. Put a couple of tablespoons of heavy cream in, have a piece of cheese, a piece of hard cheese, and maybe a mouthful of broccoli, and you're done in terms of the amount of carbs that you need to eat. So we've covered Dr. Cywes. We've covered, Dr. Boz. Let's add a couple more things to Dr. Boz. She has something that she calls the Dr. Boz ratio. Remember I said that she's all about data and all about following the numbers and all about understanding what your actual blood glucose is and all about understanding how many ketones you're burning in a day. So all of that is critically important to her plan and success on her plan. So if you're not a data geek and you don't want to measure anything and you don't want to stick your finger and find out what you are, then probably following Dr. Boz is not the better approach. And we'll get to somebody who is probably the better approach. So Dr. Boz has what she calls the Dr. Boz ratio, which is the DBR. For any of you that are measuring your ketones and your glucose, you probably have a meter, either a Keto Mojo meter or a 406 meter, FORA space 6, or Keto Mojo, which is KETO-MOJO. Both of these will sell you strips, and it's a meter, and you stick your finger, and you get readings. Keto Mojo talks about the GKI. And honestly, I don't remember what GKI stands for, but it's similar to the Dr. Boz ratio. It's not exactly the same, but the lower your GKI number, the better in ketosis you are, and the more likely you are to burn fat. Same thing with the Dr. Boz ratio. She has a scale. Dr. Boz ratio is your glucose divided by your ketones, I believe. Yeah. So if your ketones are 1 and your glucose is 100 if you're getting that reading, then your Dr. Boz ratio is 100. If your ketones are under 1, your Dr. Boz ratio will be over 100 because that division actually gives you a number larger than your actual sugar measurement. So you want to go in the other direction. So you want to have ketones. Say you've measured your glucose and it's 100 and your ketones are 2. Then your Dr. Boz ratio is 50. The lower the Dr. Boz ratio, the better off you're going to be in autophagy. Autophagy is one of those things where you burn, you get rid of bad cells, and it's something to achieve over time, if you can. I will put a graphic up that shows you the Dr. Boz ratio and how to do the division. It's very simple, and what the various levels mean to her. Okay, so that brings us, we've talked about Dr. Cywes, we've talked about Dr. Berry, we've talked about Dr. Boz. And by the way, I'm not for or against any of these. I'm 100% behind all of them. My big thing is that you need to understand for yourself what works for you. That's, if there's anything that I've learned over these past 3 years of following this way of eating, is that I have to understand me. And I have to do what I see as what makes sense. Maybe that's a couple of weeks of eating 800 calories. And I know calories don't count, but in the end, calories count. You can watch a lot of different videos about that. We don't like to talk about calories. We'd much rather talk about eliminating carbs. But bottom line, I don't care. Well, I do care. But what Dr. Berry says is eat until you're comfortably stuffed. If that's 5,000 calories and your body for the day burns 1,272, which is what mine burns in a day, I will gain weight. I don't care if all I've had is ribeye. Your body is going to put weight on if you overdo your calorie limit. So anyway, so Dr. Cywes, Dr. Berry, Dr. Boz are all contributing and all have wonderful approaches to this. None of them are wrong. I don't think any of them are wrong. I think, again, you need to learn you. So that brings us to Dr. Westman. Dr. Westman runs a clinic, has been for 22 or 23 years out of Duke University. Dr. Westman learned from Dr. Atkins. Dr. Atkins is the founder in many ways. Well, actually not, because there are actually some doctors long before Atkins that also preached a low carbohydrate way of eating. Banting comes to mind, I think, in the 1920s or something like that. But anyway, Dr. Westman is very, very well known, has had thousands of patients follow his way of eating. What's different about his is he actually gives you a list of foods. Actually, Dr. Boz gives you a list of foods also. Dr. Westman and Dr. Cywes gives you a list of foods. Dr. Berry is probably the only one who just says, eat meat. And very little else. So Dr. Westman's list is his book is End Your Carb Confusion. He is the author of that book along with Amy Berger, who is a nutritionist. There is a list that they call Phase 1 foods. It's basically the same list that you can find in Dr. Atkins' work. Dr. Atkins' first book was in 1972. A lot of us oldies started a low-carb way of eating when we were in our teens and 20s back from the 1972 book, and I know I had success with it, and I know a lot of people who have said, oh yeah, I did Dr. Atkins, and I lost 30 pounds, and I forgot all about it after that. So go back. You can get Dr. Atkins' 1972 book. I got it from Amazon. There's some booksellers, used booksellers that you can get it from. You can join. There are several different Facebook groups who actually have Dr. Atkins. If you look for an Atkins Facebook group, they actually have Dr. Atkins' 1972 book in their files. So you can go find it. He has an eating plan called Induction that he expects people to follow for 2 weeks. And it is actually the same, basically the same eating plan as Dr. Westman's. Dr. Westman does not limit it to 2 weeks. Dr. Atkins starts filling foods back in after 2 weeks. And I think that's a problem for a lot of people. A lot of people are not going to see results in the first 2 weeks. And if they start going off of it and start adding in more vegetables and things like that, it's hard to measure. You add another 2 mouthfuls of broccoli. Oh, I'm just going to go grab this piece of cauliflower. I just see these cherries sitting on the counter and I'm going to grab this one cherry. One thing leads to another, and you can deviate from Dr. Atkins' induction plan very, very quickly. So if you follow Dr. Westman, which is the current version, I would call it the current version of Dr. Atkins' work, you get about 6, and this is a big difference from the rest of the, less difference from Dr. Boz, huge difference from Dr. Berry. Not that great a difference from Dr. Cywes, because Dr. Cywes just says limit what you eat. But you have about 6 tablespoons of fats on Dr. Westman's plan. You get 2 cups of vegetables. You get as much meat as you want to eat, carbohydrate-free meat, and you get a couple of ounces, and I don't remember exactly how many, of cheese. So I think those are the major fundamentals. No nuts. No almond flours, and we're going to get into that in just a second. So Dr. Westman is probably the simplest. He doesn't have you log anything. You're not writing anything down other than you're controlling how many carbohydrates you eat. You follow his list, measure your food, and don't eyeball it because you're going to be wrong. At least in the beginning, learn what a cup of vegetables is, what, half a cup of lettuce is, how much is a quarter cup of cottage cheese, how much is 6 ounces of meat. Again, meat is unlimited, but at the same time, Dr. Westman will say, if you're not losing, to start eliminating things like cheese, reduce your caloric load, and then you kind of kick in and you kind of get the diet working. So, of these 4 folks, I lean most towards Dr. Westman because he just gives you this list and it's really simple. At the same time, I don't believe there's any yogurt on it. I think you can purchase his book. That's what I highly recommend you do, is purchase his End Your Carb Confusion book. But you can also, I think, buy his food list. I think it's $9. He has a website called Adapt Your Life, and I believe you can buy it there. There's also a Dr. Westman Facebook group. If you join his academy, you can take some classes from him. Keto Made Simple, I believe, is the name of the courses that he offers. I have taken it. It's really outstanding. He runs them, I don't know, every 3 months or something like that, and you can sign up for one of his classes. So then you have these 4 people. What I would recommend is understanding and learning why they say what they say, trying it, see how you do, and make very, very small modifications over time. So 2 weeks, unless you start getting sick, is not enough time to decide whether or not the plan is going to work for you, especially remembering that you probably have to get rid of some insulin resistance along the way. So you want to make subtle changes. For example, Dr. Westman's plan, as I said, there is a percentage of cheese. Let's say you eat. I forget what the amount is. I think it's 4 ounces, but I could be wrong. So go look it up as opposed to listening to what I'm saying to you. So you want to follow his plan, write down potentially what you're eating, make sure you're under 20 total carbs. Again, that's the foundation amount of carbohydrates for any of these docs. Almost all of the influencers will want you to eat less than 20 total grams of carbs. I have left out probably 100 influencers. I'm talking these 4 are the ones that I follow the most. Doesn't mean I don't listen to anybody else. I listen to everybody, and I try to learn as much as I can as I'm listening. And there have been aha moments that I've had. And one of the other things that you should do while you're listening to these videos from these different doctors is think to yourself and understand what they're saying. Sometimes you'll find that Dr. Boss and Dr. Berry and Dr. Westman and Dr. Cywes are saying exactly the same thing, but they're saying it in a different sentence structure, and one will click and the rest of them won't. So it's important when you listen to all these influencers to take what you can out of them and listen for some of the aha moments, because they're not necessarily saying different things, but they may phrase it to a point where suddenly you get the understanding and one makes more sense to you or appeals to you than the other. Now, there is one person that I listen to all the time and highly recommend. Well, actually, there's 2. Dr. Ben Bikman, Bikman. If you want to understand how insulin works in your body, understand why low-carb eating works, follow Dr. Bikman. He is absolutely outstanding when it comes to explaining physiology in why we should all be eating low-carb food, and why carbohydrates are so insanely bad for us. The other person is, and he also wrote a book, which I'll put down in the notes somewhere because I can't remember the name of it, on why we get sick. He wrote a book called Why We Get Sick. Outstanding book. I'd highly recommend reading that. The other person who I would recommend you listen to is Dr. Sten Ekberg, which is Sten, and then I believe it's either Eckberg or Ekberg. I don't follow him, so to speak, but if I don't understand something and I want to get a better idea of why things work, he has, I think personally, the absolute best videos. They're all charted. So he writes everything down. He draws diagrams, and his explanations for all of the physiological stuff that goes on are absolutely outstanding. I believe he's a chiropractor someplace in the South, but absolutely top-notch in terms of explaining why we do what we do. Then there's a lot of people who are what I would call one level under the 4 people that I just talked about, in the sense that they follow one of these 4 people and perhaps bring the information home a little bit easier to understand. So I would also recommend, listening to whoever you find that is working for you. If you have a person that makes sense and that you want to follow, and it's not one of the 4 people I just mentioned, that's absolutely fine. Just, listen and understand and pay attention to your own body. I think that's the most important thing. One last thing, and that is that there's a ton of influencers out there who range in age from their mid-20s, I want to say, to their mid-60s. If you include me as an influencer, which would be wonderful, but even if you don't, I'm 71. Our bodies change as we age. And there are a few influencers who are quite young who provide information which isn't wrong, but it works better for people who are younger. Our metabolisms change, our bodies change, our needs change, how we eat changes. And I kind of feel like try to find an influencer in your age group, because they're going to have a little bit better understanding of what's happening in their own body and how that relates to what might be happening in your body. So middle-aged and up, if you're middle-aged and up, find somebody that's middle-aged and up. Just a recommendation out there. It's probably just going to work a little bit better for you. So I think that's it for today. I hope that made sense. I probably forgot half of what I wanted to say because I'm doing all this unscripted, as everybody has recommended that you don't like the script. You'd much rather have me just talk extemporaneously. I think I managed to say everything that I needed to say. If I didn't, I'll just do part B. So take a look at that. I do want to ask you to please like and subscribe to me. I have something in the order of 70 subscribers. It would be wonderful to get up to 100. YouTube doesn't care about anybody that doesn't have less than 1,000. Onward and upward, if possible. And the other thing I would like to ask is if you would consider sharing my videos on your various Facebook groups that you're at. I, as an influencer, well, as a person who is making the videos, for most groups, cannot promote my own videos. They do not allow me to post. There are 2 wonderful groups that I belong to that do, which is fantastic, and I thank you so much for that. Most of the Facebook groups that I belong to will not allow me to self-promote. Even though I'm not selling anything, self-promotion is self-promotion, and it's just not allowed. What you can do to help me is to share, assuming that you find anything that I say useful to you. You can go up onto your Facebook groups, and even if they don't allow links, you can certainly say, please listen to this episode of Tina Talks Keto. You can find it on YouTube. I'm the only one that is Tina Talks Keto, so you can just mention that. You don't have to put in the link, and anybody that wants to can go and listen to it. And I would really, really greatly appreciate that. So thank you all for listening, sticking with me, especially with the big lapse I had between the last set of videos and these new ones. I promise I will do more videos more frequently. I do want to grow my channel. I also created a Facebook page called Tina Talks Keto. So you can post questions on there, anything that you'd like. I will be posting videos on there. I'm probably also going to write a few blogs. I have a website, tinatalksketo.com, where again, I will be posting the videos, and if I can get my son-in-law to help me figure out how to make this website work, I will add blogs to that as well. Thank you so much for listening, and everybody have a great day. Take care.